London, summer of 1858. Parliament is in session, but members of the House of Commons are fleeing the chamber with handkerchiefs pressed against their faces as the Thames flows past outside, thick and brown, releasing a stench so overpowering that men retch in the corridors. The river has become an open sewer, and the heat has turned it into a biological weapon aimed directly at the seat of British power. This is the Great Stink, the crisis that would force the most powerful empire on Earth to admit it was drowning in its own waste. The cesspools of London. To understand how London arrived at this catastrophic moment, you have to understand what passed for waste management in the 1840s. It wasn't a system, it was a patchwork of medieval solutions held together by desperation and denial. Every house, every building had a cesspool, a brick-lined pit beneath the property where human waste accumulated. The contents sat there, fermenting in the London clay, until someone decided it needed emptying. That someone was usually the landlord, and the decision was usually made as late as humanly possible because emptying a cesspool cost money. Enter the nightmen. They arrived after dark, when the respectable citizens of London were asleep and couldn't witness the grotesque reality of urban sanitation. These men descended into the cesspools with buckets and shovels, hauling out decades of accumulated filth. The work was brutal. The fumes were toxic. Men passed out in the pits. Some died there. But the economics were perfect for everyone, except the nightmen themselves. Landlords paid as little as possible for the service. The nightmen charged what the market would bear, and the waste itself had value. Human excrement was sold to farmers as fertilizer. The night soil trade was a legitimate business, a circular economy where London's waste became the countryside's nutrition. The problem was scale. In 1700, London's population was around 550,000. By 1850, it had exploded to 2.3 million. The cesspool system that had barely functioned for a medieval city was being asked to handle the waste of an industrial metropolis. It couldn't. The cesspools overflowed. They leaked into the groundwater. They collapsed into basements. The entire city was effectively sitting on top of a lake of sewage, slowly seeping through the porous London clay. The Thames became the safety valve. When cesspools filled to capacity, when the nightmen couldn't keep pace, when landlords refused to pay for proper maintenance, the waste went into the river. Not through any organized system. Through illegal connections, through deliberate dumping, through the natural flow of gravity pulling filth downward toward the water. The river couldn't cope. Every day, millions of gallons of raw sewage poured into the Thames from over 200,000 cesspools and hundreds of old drainage ditches. The volume overwhelmed the river's natural capacity to dilute and disperse the waste. The water turned from gray to brown to black. By the middle of the 19th century, the Thames was biologically dead. The salmon that had once thrived there were extinct. The water ran black. The smell was omnipresent, a fact of London life that residents claimed to no longer notice. This was the accepted baseline. This was normal. The wealthy consoled themselves with the belief that they were insulated from the worst effects. They lived in neighborhoods with better drainage. They could afford to have their cesspools emptied more frequently. Some even purchased filtered water from private companies. The poor, crowded into tenements with overflowing cesspools and no access to clean water, bore the brunt of the system's failure. This inequality seemed natural. This was how cities worked. The rich enjoyed better conditions than the poor. Nobody questioned it. Nobody imagined that the entire structure was built on a foundation of biological time bombs waiting to explode. But normal doesn't mean safe. While Londoners congratulated themselves on their tolerance for unpleasant odors, something invisible was breeding in that putrid water. Something that would kill tens of thousands before anyone understood what it was. The invisible killer, cholera, arrived in London in 1831, imported from India through the trading routes that made Britain wealthy. Nobody understood what it was or how it spread. They just knew that healthy people could be dead within hours, their bodies drained of fluids, their skin turned blue. The disease didn't discriminate by class initially. It killed merchants and laborers, women and children, the pious and the profane. Death came with terrifying speed. A man could wake up healthy, feel the first stomach cramps by noon, and be dead before sunset. The medical establishment had an explanation: miasma theory. The belief that disease was caused by bad air, by the foul vapors rising from decomposing organic matter. It made perfect sense. London smelled terrible, and people in the worst-smelling districts died at higher rates. The correlation seemed obvious. Doctors walked through afflicted neighborhoods and reported the overwhelming stench. The connection between smell and death appeared undeniable. This theory had consequences. If disease came from bad air, then the solution was ventilation. Open the windows, clear the fumes, let fresh air circulate. The Thames, reeking as it was, became a victim of this logic. The solution to the smell was dilution. Flush more water through. Build more drainage to carry waste to the river faster. Speed up the flow. Every attempt to solve the problem made it worse. The faster they flushed waste into the Thames, the more contaminated the water became. The water companies embraced this approach enthusiastically. They constructed new pipes to draw water from the Thames more efficiently. They built distribution networks to carry this water throughout the city. They marketed their product as clean and safe, advertising the purity of London water in newspapers and pamphlets. The fact that they were drawing supply from a river that received millions of gallons of raw sewage daily was considered irrelevant. After all, the river was flowing. The water looked clear after it settled. What could possibly be wrong? Dr. John Snow saw something different. During the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho, he mapped every death. He walked the streets with a notebook, marking addresses, recording names, documenting the pattern. The pattern was undeniable. The victims clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow investigated and discovered that a cesspool was leaking directly into the water supply. He removed the pump handle, and the outbreak stopped. It was the simplest, most elegant proof imaginable. Snow went further. He compared cholera rates between different water companies serving the same neighborhoods. The Southwark and Vauxhall Company drew water from the most polluted section of the Thames. The Lambeth Company had recently moved its intake upstream to a cleaner area. Snow's data showed that households supplied by Southwark and Vauxhall had cholera death rates 14 times higher than those supplied by Lambeth. The only variable was the water source. This should have changed everything. Snow had proven that cholera spread through contaminated water, not bad air. He had identified the mechanism. He had shown the solution. But the medical establishment ignored him. Miasma theory was too deeply entrenched, supported by centuries of medical tradition. The idea that invisible organisms in water could kill seemed absurd compared to the obvious reality of foul-smelling air. How could something you couldn't see or smell be more dangerous than the overwhelming stench that filled every street? The water companies fought Snow's findings viciously. If he was right, they were liable for thousands of deaths. Their entire business model depended on the public believing that Thames water was safe to drink. They funded counter-studies. They pressured medical journals. They used their political connections to suppress Snow's work. They had shareholders to protect, dividends to pay, infrastructure to justify. The death toll mounted. The 1849 outbreak killed 14,000. The 1854 outbreak killed another 10,000. The 1866 outbreak would kill 6,000 more. Each epidemic followed the same pattern. The disease spread along the water supply. The poor, who drank from contaminated wells and pumps fed by the Thames, died in staggering numbers. The wealthy, who could afford filtered water or had access to cleaner sources, survived at much higher rates. But London's leaders refused to see the truth. The economic implications were too staggering. If cholera spread through water, then the entire infrastructure of the city was a death trap. The cesspools, the Thames, the water companies drawing supply from the polluted river. The whole system would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The cost would be millions of pounds. The disruption would be enormous. The cost of denial was measured in corpses, but the cost of action seemed impossible to bear, until the summer of 1858, when nature made the decision for them. The engineer who saw differently. Joseph Bazalgette was not a doctor or a scientist. He was an engineer, a man who thought in terms of gradients, volumes, and structural loads. Born in 1819 to a family of French descent, he had trained under the great railway engineers of the Industrial Revolution. He understood large-scale infrastructure projects in a way that few men in Britain could match. By 1849, Bazalgette was working for the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, a bureaucratic body tasked with the impossible job of managing London's waste. The commission had no real power, no budget, and no political support. It was a token gesture, a way for Parliament to appear concerned about sanitation without actually doing anything expensive. But Bazalgette took the job seriously. He walked the streets of London with surveying equipment, measuring elevations to the inch. He studied the city's topology, noting every rise and fall in the landscape. He measured the flow of the Thames at different times of day, different seasons, different weather conditions. He calculated the volume of waste produced by 2.3 million people every single day. And he realized something that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. London's sewage problem wasn't a matter of better management. It required complete reconstruction. The existing system, such as it was, consisted of roughly 200,000 cesspools and a chaotic network of old drainage ditches originally designed to carry rainwater. These ditches, built centuries earlier when London was a fraction of its current size, had been converted into open sewers that fed directly into the Thames. The result was a city drowning in its own filth, with no coherent plan to get it out. Bazalgette envisioned something different. A comprehensive network of underground intercepting sewers that would catch waste before it reached the river. The sewers would run parallel to the Thames, capturing the outflow from the old drainage system and carrying it downstream, far beyond the city, where it could be released into the estuary at high tide. The tidal flow would carry the waste out to sea before it could return. The engineering challenge was staggering. The sewers would need to handle not just the normal daily flow of waste, but also the massive influx of stormwater during heavy rains. They would need to maintain a consistent gradient to ensure flow without constant pumping. And they would need to be built beneath a city that was already fully developed, threading beneath buildings, roads, and the existing infrastructure without causing catastrophic collapses. Bazalgette spent months on the calculations. London needed 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, connected to over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers. The system would require massive pumping stations to lift sewage from the low-lying areas to the higher elevations required for gravity flow to the outfall points. It would take years to build and cost millions of pounds. But Bazalgette also understood something that the medical establishment didn't. It didn't matter whether cholera spread through bad air or contaminated water. Either way, getting the sewage out of the Thames would solve the problem. If miasma theory was correct, the sewers would eliminate the source of foul vapors. If snow was correct, the sewers would stop sewage from contaminating the water supply. Bazalgette didn't need to win the medical debate. He just needed to build the infrastructure. In 1852, Bazalgette presented his plan to Parliament. The reaction was swift and brutal. The laughter of Parliament. The members of Parliament looked at Bazalgette's proposal and saw madness. Millions of pounds to build sewers, underground tunnels spanning the entire city, massive pumping stations driven by steam engines. The whole thing seemed like an engineer's fantasy, disconnected from economic reality. The opposition came from multiple directions, each faction protecting its own interests under the guise of concern for the public good. The Thames water companies, which drew their supply directly from the river and sold it to Londoners, saw the sewer plan as an implicit admission that their product was killing people. If the government spent millions to clean the Thames, it would validate the claims that the water was contaminated. Their business model depended on denial. They had invested heavily in pumping stations and distribution networks designed to extract water from the Thames. If the public lost confidence in that water, their infrastructure became worthless overnight. The cesspool emptiers and night soil merchants had even more to lose. If waste went into sewers instead of cesspools, their entire industry would vanish overnight. Thousands of men would lose their livelihoods. The fertilizer trade would be disrupted. And for what? To solve a problem that most people didn't even believe existed. These men had families. They had communities built around this industry. They lobbied Parliament aggressively, painting Bazalgette's plan as an attack on honest working men. The miasma theory advocates argued that building sewers would make things worse. If you buried waste underground, you would trap the foul vapors beneath the city. Better to leave it in the open where air could ventilate it. Bazalgette's plan, they claimed, would turn London into a subterranean plague pit. The sewers would concentrate the miasma, creating pockets of deadly air that would poison anyone who ventured near them. But the real opposition was economic. The British Empire was at its peak. London was the wealthiest city in the world, and Parliament simply refused to believe that such a rich, powerful place could be undone by something as mundane as the waste disposal. The problem seemed solvable through incremental improvements, better cesspool maintenance, more efficient nightmen, perhaps some additional drainage here and there. The idea that the entire system needed to be torn out and rebuilt was too radical, too expensive, too disruptive. Members of Parliament mocked Bazalgette's calculations. They questioned his competence. They suggested that if the problem were really as dire as he claimed, surely someone would have solved it already. One member famously declared that he would rather trust the wisdom of the Thames than the theories of an engineer. The river had sustained London for 2,000 years. It would continue to do so. Building massive sewers was an admission of defeat, a confession that British civilization couldn't manage its own waste. The debate revealed a fundamental disconnect between engineering reality and political imagination. Bazalgette was proposing a solution that would work for a city of 5 million people, even though London's population was only 2.3 million. Parliament saw this as wasteful excess. Bazalgette saw it as necessary foresight. The argument was unresolvable because they were operating from completely different time frames. Parliament thought in election cycles. Bazalgette thought in generations. Bazalgette's proposal was rejected. The Metropolitan Commission of Sewers continued its ineffective tinkering. The cesspools continued to overflow. The Thames continued to receive millions of gallons of raw sewage every day, and cholera continued to kill. The commissioners tried smaller measures. They mandated that cesspools be emptied more frequently. They fined landlords whose properties leaked into the street. They built a few small drainage improvements in the worst affected neighborhoods. None of it worked. The scale of the problem demanded a solution that matched its magnitude. Anything less was just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. Then came the summer of 1858. Nature's ultimatum. The heat arrived early that year and stayed. By June, London was sweltering under temperatures that turned the Thames into a biological disaster area. The combination of low water levels and high temperatures accelerated the decomposition of organic matter. The smell didn't just get worse, it became a physical presence, a miasma that actually fit the medical theory named after it. Parliament was in session, and the building sat right on the riverbank. The members of the House of Commons tried to continue their work, but the stench was overpowering. Men vomited. The curtains soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to mask the smell offered no protection. The windows had to be kept closed, despite the heat, turning the chamber into a suffocating box. The newspapers called it the Great Stink. The Times wrote that the Thames had become an open sewer, that the capital of the greatest empire on earth smelled like a cesspool. Foreign diplomats complained. Business leaders threatened to relocate. The city that prided itself on being the center of civilization was being brought to its knees by its own excrement. On June 14th, a debate was called to address the crisis. Members stood to speak and were driven from the podium by waves of stench rolling in from the river. Benjamin Disraeli, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, attempted to deliver a speech on the budget. He made it 3 minutes before abandoning the lectern, overcome by the smell. The situation was untenable. Parliament could not function under these conditions. This was the crisis Bazalgette had been waiting for. Not because he took pleasure in the suffering, but because he understood that meaningful change only happens when the people in power experience the consequences of inaction personally. For years, cholera had killed the poor, while the wealthy remained insulated. But the Great Stink was indiscriminate. It invaded Westminster itself. The members of Parliament who had mocked Bazalgette's proposal 6 years earlier were now begging for any solution that would let them return to their chambers. The economics that had seemed so prohibitive in 1852 suddenly looked reasonable. The technical challenges that had seemed insurmountable now appeared manageable. The alternative was abandoning London entirely. On July 18, 1858, Parliament passed an enabling act in just 18 days, a speed unheard of in British legislative history. The bill authorized the Metropolitan Board of Works to construct a comprehensive sewer system for London. The budget was £3 million, an enormous sum equivalent to billions in modern currency. But nobody questioned it anymore. The alternative was abandoning the capital. Bazalgette was appointed chief engineer. He had 18 days to finalize his plans. The project that Parliament had mocked for 6 years was now desperately urgent. The laughter had stopped. The begging had begun. Building the impossible, Bazalgette had been preparing for this moment since 1852. He had refined his calculations, improved his designs, and mapped every inch of London's topology. When Parliament finally gave him the authority and funding, he was ready to move. The plan called for 2 systems running parallel to the Thames, one on the north bank and one on the south. Each system consisted of 3 main intercepting sewers at different elevations, designed to capture waste from different parts of the city. The high-level sewer caught drainage from the elevated areas like Hampstead and Highgate. The middle-level sewer handled the central districts. The low-level sewer, running closest to the river, intercepted the final outflows before they reached the Thames. The northern system was the more complex of the 2. It required 82 miles of brick-lined tunnels, some large enough to drive a carriage through. The main intercepting sewer ran from West London to Abbey Mills in the east, where a massive pumping station would lift the sewage to a higher elevation for the final journey to the outfall at Beckton. The Abbey Mills pumping station became a cathedral of Victorian engineering. Bazalgette designed it with 8 beam engines, each capable of lifting sewage against gravity with mechanical precision. The building itself was ornate, decorated with Byzantine-style architecture that seemed absurdly elaborate for a sewage facility. But Bazalgette understood something important. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was a symbol, a statement that civilization could conquer nature through engineering, and that even the disposal of waste deserved beauty and dignity. The construction was brutal. Workers excavated by hand, digging trenches through London clay, while the city continued to function above them. They worked in shifts around the clock. Cave-ins were common. Men died when tunnels collapsed, or when they were overcome by toxic gases trapped in the excavations. The brick linings were laid with precision, each tunnel constructed to maintain the exact gradient needed for flow. Too steep and the sewage would rush through too quickly, eroding the bricks. Too shallow and it would stagnate, creating blockages. Bazalgette personally supervised the calculations. He over-engineered everything. When his surveyors calculated the population that the sewers would need to serve, he doubled it. When they estimated the volume of stormwater, he tripled the capacity. This wasn't waste, it was foresight. Bazalgette was building not just for 1860, but for the London of the next century. The tunnels had to navigate beneath a living city. They threaded beneath roads that couldn't be closed for long. They passed under buildings that couldn't be undermined. They crossed beneath railway lines and canals. Every intersection required careful engineering to ensure the structure above remained stable while the excavation below proceeded. The southern system required different engineering solutions. The south bank of the Thames was lower and flatter, making gravity drainage more difficult. Bazalgette designed the southern outfall sewer to run from Deptford to Crossness, where another massive pumping station would lift the sewage for release into the Thames estuary. The Crossness facility matched Abbey Mills in scale and exceeded it in architectural ambition. The engine house featured 4 beam engines nicknamed Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra. These were not just machines, they were monuments, decorated with cast iron columns, ornamental metalwork, and polished brass fittings that gleamed in the dim light filtering through the high windows. Each engine weighed hundreds of tons. Each could pump millions of gallons per day. Together, they represented the largest concentration of steam power ever dedicated to a single purpose. The fuel consumption was enormous. The maintenance requirements were constant, but the alternative was London drowning in sewage. The project took 12 years to complete. By 1865, the main intercepting sewers were operational. By 1870, the entire system was finished. 1,000 miles of street sewers connecting to 82 miles of intercepting sewers, all feeding into 2 outfall stations that released waste far downstream from the city. The cost exceeded £4 million, 33% over budget. But London had been transformed. The cesspools were closed. The Thames began to recover. And cholera, the invisible killer that had haunted London for decades, simply vanished. The transformation. The last major cholera outbreak in London occurred in 1866, before the southern section of Bazalgette's sewers was complete. The disease hit the East End, where sewage still flowed into the water supply. 4,000 people died. Then the southern system came online, and cholera disappeared, not reduced, not managed, eliminated. The disease that had killed tens of thousands simply stopped. The correlation was undeniable. The sewer system worked. John Snow had died in 1858, just months after Parliament finally authorized the sewers. He never saw his theory proven correct. He never witnessed the vindication of his research. But the data collected after the sewers opened proved him right beyond any doubt. Cholera spread through water. The sewers removed the contaminated water. The disease vanished. The impact went beyond disease prevention. The Thames recovered its ecology. Fish returned. The smell dissipated. The river that had been biologically dead for decades came back to life. Londoners who had lived with the stench for so long barely recognized the transformation. The economic impact was more subtle but equally profound. Property values along the Thames increased. Businesses returned to the riverfront. The docks, which had been losing traffic to rival ports because sailors refused to endure London's smell, became competitive again. The city that had been slowly suffocating under its own waste suddenly had room to grow again. Most importantly, Bazalgette had proven that large-scale urban problems could be solved through systematic engineering. The project demonstrated that investing in infrastructure wasn't just practical, it was economically rational. The cost of building the sewers was enormous, but the cost of not building them was incalculable. The sewers became a tourist attraction. Foreign engineers traveled to London to study the system. Cities across Europe and America sent delegations to examine Bazalgette's designs. The Abbey Mills and Crossness pumping stations welcomed visitors who marveled at the combination of engineering precision and architectural beauty. Bazalgette received a knighthood in 1874. The recognition was belated and insufficient for a man who had saved tens of thousands of lives and secured London's future as a viable city. But he accepted it with characteristic modesty, insisting that the real credit belonged to the workers who had built the system under dangerous conditions. The Invisible Empire. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers are still functioning. The system built in the 1860s carries waste for a city of 9 million people, triple the population it was designed to serve. Bazalgette's habit of over-engineering, of building for capacity that seemed absurd at the time, gave London a sewer system that lasted more than 150 years. The brick tunnels remain structurally sound. The gradients still ensure proper flow. The pumping stations, now powered by modern electric motors instead of steam engines, continue to lift sewage against gravity. The system has been expanded and upgraded, but the core infrastructure that Bazalgette designed remains the foundation of London's sanitation. The principle he established spread globally. Every modern city sits atop a hidden network of sewers, an invisible infrastructure that makes urban life possible. We take it for granted now. We expect waste to vanish the moment we flush. But that expectation, that baseline assumption of modern civilization, was built by engineers like Bazalgette, who saw past the denial and understood that human waste isn't a moral failing or a minor inconvenience. It's a physics problem that requires a physics solution. The Great Stink forced Parliament to confront what they had been denying for decades. The wealthy could no longer insulate themselves from the consequences of urban sanitation failure. When the smell invaded Westminster, when the river threatened to shut down the government itself, the impossible became urgent, and the expensive became necessary. This is the lesson that keeps repeating throughout history. Infrastructure is invisible until it fails. We ignore the pipes, the pumps, the tunnels beneath our feet until the day they stop working. Then we panic. Then we pay whatever it costs. Then we promise we'll never let it get that bad again. But Bazalgette showed us something more important than crisis management. He showed us that you can solve problems before they become catastrophes if you're willing to listen to the engineers who actually understand the scale of what you're facing. Parliament laughed at his proposal until they were choking on their own sewage. Then they begged him to save them. And he did. Because the calculations had been ready for 6 years, waiting for the moment when politics finally caught up with physics.